This is episode 11, auxiliary and lexical verbs and their differences. Now, I mentioned back in video 4 when we were looking at word classes that some people choose to break verbs into two separate word classes. They call these two word classes lexical verbs or auxiliary verbs. I have chosen not to separate them by word class because they share a lot of morphological features, even though semantically and syntactically they are quite different. In this video, I'm going to focus on what lexical verbs and auxiliary verbs are and what makes them different. And coming up soon, we'll look at those morphological features that make them the same. So let's just jump right in. Firstly, let's just try to spot a lexical verb and an auxiliary verb. Take the following sentence. I have been waiting for you for ages. In this sentence, there are three verbs. Two of them are auxiliary verbs and one is a lexical verb. The auxiliary verbs are have and been. And the lexical verb is waiting. The function of have is to provide aspect. I'm just going to write verb auxiliary here. Verb auxiliary and verb lexical. So what aspect is that it tells us when the speaker is speaking in relation to when the event occurred. Been provides the functional understanding that the event has occurred over a period of time and not just at one point in time. And the lexical verb waiting, or to wait, provides us with a meaningful understanding about what I have been doing. So that's what they are, but let's get into the nitty-gritty of what makes them different. To begin with, lexical verbs are an open class, which, as you may remember, means that there are often new words. So we'll write that. So with open class words, there are often new words and the words are open to change. But auxiliary verbs are a closed class. Therefore, I can't possibly list all the lexical verbs, but I can list all the auxiliary verbs. The auxiliary verbs, there's two kinds, primary and modal, and we'll get into that in the next video. But our primary auxiliary verbs are be, have, and do, or dummy do as I like to call it. And our modal auxiliary verbs are words like will, can, could, may, might, shall, should, would, must, and have to. So let's write some of those down. Now, be, have, and do can all be lexical verbs too. So that's why having our three criteria, semantics, morphology, and syntactic behaviour to identify word types are really important. So let's look at some other differences. Semantic differences. Semantically, a lexical verb is a doing word, or more specifically, it's a doing, having, or being word. Lexical verbs can describe actions, processes, states of feeling, or thinking and relating events. So let's write that down. So some examples of lexical verbs are play, as in the woman played the violin, and that's a doing word. Or wonder, as in she wondered about her grades. Or turn, as in Mark turned 16 years old last week. So that's also being words and having words. So these are all lexical verbs. Now, a primary auxiliary verb, on the other hand, is purely functional. Among other things, they can tell us whether something occurs over a period of time, when the event occurred in relation to the speaker reporting it, and they can even provide emphasis. So primary auxiliaries are extremely functional verbs. They carry no specific meaning. Modal auxiliary verbs are also functional, but they tell us how likely something is to occur. So that modal verbs are also functional. They tell us how likely something is to occur. So we're going to look at the differences between modal auxiliary verbs and primary auxiliary verbs in the next video. But they're the semantic differences. Let's move on now to the morphological differences between the lexical and auxiliary verbs. Now there is actually only one inflectional morphological difference, and that is because morphology is where lexical and auxiliary verbs have the most in common. And that's where they share most of their similarities. So the inflectional morphological difference is that auxiliary verbs can be truncated, whereas lexical verbs cannot. So what that means is that I will can become I'll, or you would could become you'd, she is becomes she's, and those kinds of truncations, whereas lexical verbs cannot be truncated. So you can't have he plays to haze, for example. It just doesn't work. So as far as derivational morphology goes, it's the lexical verb that can derive from the original meaning or that can be changed into a different word class, not the auxiliary. So common endings to lexical verbs include ate, n, ify or phi, and i's, such as procrastinate, emblazon, modify, and prioritize. These are all lexical verbs. Auxiliary verbs, because they're a closed class, don't change. Let's look at the syntactic differences now. Syntactically, a lexical verb can stand alone. And there can only be one lexical verb in a verb phrase and consequently a clause. In the case of the original sentence back here, that lexical verb was waiting. Auxiliary verbs, on the other hand, can only become before a lexical verb. They can't stand alone. In our original sentence, there were two auxiliary verbs. Let's take a look at those. Have and been. But there can be up to 4 auxiliary verbs per verb phrase. And I know I'm using verb phrase and clause here. We will take a look at those soon. I do actually have a wonderful sentence here which shows how there can be 4 auxiliary verbs in a verb phrase. The X factor must have been being watched by millions of viewers that night. So our auxiliary verbs are must, have, been, being. So they're all our auxiliary verbs. And our lexical verb here is watched by millions of viewers that night. So that's 4 auxiliary verbs, must have, been and being, 1 lexical verb, watched, and the sentence makes perfect sense. So there you go. We have lexical verbs and auxiliary verbs, and they can be classed as 2 different word classes due to their semantic, morphological and syntactic differences. Not to mention that lexical verbs are open class and auxiliary verbs are closed class. I also mentioned that there were 2 types of auxiliary verbs, primary auxiliary verbs and modal auxiliary verbs. So next video, before we look at the similarities between primary and auxiliary verbs, we need to look a little more deeply into what primary and modal auxiliary verbs are. So that's where we're going next. And until then, thanks for watching The Language Code.